After the previous episode of quite a lot of godless behavior in chapter 34 of Genesis, we now have God's appearance taking place again, as it has happened a couple of times in Genesis before now. And God appears to Jacob once again and reveals himself by describing himself. So he speaks about himself in the third person. We've got God speaking about himself, and so he's naming himself. And there we see the connection between God's name and God's revelation, his self-revelation to the patriarchs, especially in Genesis still. And the way in which he does it is that he tells the story of how Jacob first came into direct contact with him, so in the sense of divine revelation, not just by tradition, which took place in Bethel, if you remember that story, where Jacob also sees the ladder in his dream. And this connection between name and revelation is an interaction that to me is very closely connected with the Father and the Son. So the Father is the one who names the Son, who makes it clear that the Son is his manifestation on the earth, so the manifestation of his word in the world, by describing him through divine revelation to his chosen people. And that's exactly who Jacob is in this story. And the way in which God describes himself is as the El, which has been translated as power in the story of Laban, for example, but it's a divinity. So he is the divinity who appeared, so he actually showed himself to Jacob when Jacob was fleeing from Esau. So there was a situation in which Jacob was in desperate need, and in this situation God shows himself to Jacob in a way that kind of implies that Jacob wasn't necessarily actively looking for God, but that God recognized Jacob's need and acted on that in such a way that suddenly Jacob was confronted by this God that he had maybe heard about in the house of his father, but that he had never personally met in the same way. And after God reveals himself to Jacob again, speaks with him, and gives him some guidance, Jacob goes back to his household and he tells them three things. He says, put aside your foreign gods, purify yourselves on the other hand. And a part of that purification is that they have to change their garments. And these are all things that are taken up again in the New Testament in a very powerful way. Because what's happening here, if one really thinks about what clothing is, for example, it's kind of a second skin. And we see that in Genesis 3 as well. After Adam and Eve have been thrown out of the garden, they're given clothing to cover their shame and to protect them in the wilderness that has become suddenly very aggressive towards them, that has become antagonistic towards them. And so your clothing is that which protects you, but as you go through life and as you fail in life and as you are damaged in life and so on, the clothing that you wear is also battered and torn and so on. But the person who lies beneath the clothing is protected by the clothing. And so when there's a change of clothing, it's kind of like a rebirth or a renewal of that which protects you. It's in some ways a renewal of the covenant or the promises that God has made with you. And so that's something that's going on here. And the purification, the washing off of the dust and the dirt on the skin of the body that lies beneath the clothing, is the renewal of that which is internal, so the renewal of the heart, which is also very important for baptism and repentance in general. And the renewal of the clothing is then the embodiment of the renewal of the heart on the outside. So it's the internal and the external, the microcosm inside, and the carrying out what has happened within you into the world outside of you through the action, the behavior that is then determined by the new direction that your heart has been given. And the action that Jacob is led to and that he leads his house into then is that they get up and they move out of the land in which his name has become a bad smell before the other people. And this connection between the dreadful acts that Judah and Simeon, I said Simon in the previous video, but it's actually often translated as Simeon or transliterated because Simon and Simeon are actually the same name in Hebrew. But anyway, so Simeon and Judah committed this terrible act. They literally slaughtered an entire city of men and took their children and women afterwards and their cattle and so on. It must have been quite a gruesome massacre. And that if it, when it reached the other cities, the city-states that were lying around, the rumor must have devastated the neighbors of Jacob because it's such a deceptive act, the thing that his children did. And now they also purify themselves ritually in this very religious way. And they get up from where they were staying and they move through the country so they can be observed by the watchmen and the scouts of the other city-states and farms and homesteads and who knows what. And on the brink of leaving the country, Jacob says, we are doing this rebirth in the name of the God who answered me. So there's a response that takes place to Jacob's situation, the situation of need. Even though Jacob didn't know who was going to answer him, the answer came unexpectedly. And he also describes God as the one who went with him in the way that he has gone. So God accompanies Jacob on the way that Jacob went, according to the counsel of his mother, and he blessed that which Jacob did. So there's also this kind of God working through that which we do, despite the fact that it sometimes is not good. But he can turn even the evil things that we do into something that is beneficial for his ultimate purposes. And so he often does what is unexpected and can turn even the greatest tragedy into a comedy, as we see in the resurrection of his son. And he then also says, because this is the God that we are following, put aside all of the foreign gods. So if one thinks about the women and children that have now, come into their midst as well from the city of Shechem that's been decimated, the foreign gods that they have brought with them are also in their midst, and the gods of Laban that Rachel brought with her, they're also there, and all of the other gods that have crept into the household of Jacob, and that he also might still have known from his travels, and that he might have turned to from time to time. That's all now going to be put aside, and so the people in the household of Jacob give him their gods. He buries them under a terebinth tree that's there in Canaan where they were staying, and he also gets earrings from them, which is also quite fascinating, because earrings is in many ways a sign of slavery, because the earring bears the mark of the master that you're enslaved to, and it demarks you as property. So the earring might have shown that they belong to previous masters if they're now conquered members of the household of Jacob, so they belong maybe to Shechem, and maybe they had earrings that showed that, and now they belong to Jacob's household, and maybe some also carried earrings that symbolize their belonging to Jacob. But in the end, it always shows that there's an obedience, so they're willing to listen to and obey a voice that speaks to them. And in many cases, it might also have just been an earring that shows that they're bound to a certain god, that they're obedient to a certain god, and they're enslaved to this god then. And so all the false gods are taken away, and their obedience to false gods is also taken away. And it's all buried under this terebinth in Canaan. And after that, they move through the country, and the terror of God is upon the cities that watch them from a distance. And the cities don't pursue them, despite the fact that they could, classify them as a threat and then try to get rid of them as quickly and violently as possible, because of what they did to Shechem. Because also of the exclusivity of their religion, which would have posed a threat to the more pluralistic religions of the time. It would have made sense that these cities would have seen Jacob and his household as a threat in the landscape. And when Jacob gets back to Bethel and God appears to him there, the way in which this first encounter in which Jacob met God in Bethel is described as that God denuded himself to Jacob, just in the same way as Noah was denuded when he kind of fell into his tent naked in Genesis 9, which is also a very interesting story and very important. And because of this, the place is called Bethel, is what Jacob then says. And that's really interesting, because the house is also then the place where you can become vulnerable, where you can denude yourself, you can take off your clothes, for example, if one thinks back to the significance of clothing, and be open all the way to the heart. So really vulnerable in its essential meaning. When they've arrived in Bethel, there's a death that takes place, which is kind of a foreshadowing of what happens in the second half of this chapter, which I'll get to in the next video. It's the death of Deborah. It's a name that comes up in the book of Judges as well, which is really interesting. It means the bee, and it's a handmaid of Rebecca, and it also shows maybe who's going to die in the second half, spoilers of the chapter. She is then buried under the oak, the Elon Bahut. From Bethel, they then moved to Padan Aram, and here, Jacob's been here before. This is also the place where Bethuel lives, who's the father of Rebecca, Jacob's mother. So it's also kind of a part of the story of the patriarchs. It's also kind of homeland or familiar territory to these patriarchs, to Jacob and to his household, who are traveling through the country all the time, these nomads. So they come back to this familiar territory. And here God once again reaffirms that Jacob will no longer be named Jacob, but he will now be called Israel, the one who wrestles with God, as we saw in the previous story where Jacob literally wrestles with God, who appears to him as a man. And here God calls himself El Shaddai, which means God the Almighty. At least that's how it's often translated. You could also say God the Destroyer, which is quite interesting. So he's the one who really does have the power over life and death. And it's interesting in the shadow of the fact that Deborah has died. And so now, in the face of this dreadful moment of tragedy again, God asserts himself and says, I'm the one who creates and destroys all things. I have the power. I am almighty. And I, as the almighty God, whom you serve and fear and love and trust, command you again. And this is taking up the first commandment that's ever mentioned in the Bible, which is in Genesis 2, where God tells humanity, be fruitful and multiply. And he tells Jacob the same thing here, just like he told Abraham and so on. Be fruitful and multiply a nation, and then a congregation of nations, which is probably a reference to the 12 sons of Israel. And then he also says, and kings will proceed from you. And that's very similar to the blessing that Ishmael is given for the sake of Abraham, who will also father 12 princes. But now Jacob is one who fathers kings and a congregation of nations. And he is also given this promise that Abraham is given, the promise of being the father of many. God then ascends back into heaven, and there we can think of the ladder again that appears to us in the story of Jacob's dream. And because of this, Jacob regards this place as holy. He sets up a pillar there and anoints the pillar, and he also pours out a drink offering on the earth. And I think in the religious studies that take a look at the Oriental religions, they classify this as a ritual that has a lot to do with fertility, but from the kind of biblical cosmology, one can also understand it as being something that prophesies the Messiah, because the stone that is erected is the cornerstone on which God builds his church, who is the beginning and the end of creation, the one through whom all things are made. It's a pillar that's set up and direct to heaven, kind of like mountains and so on, so it's pointing upwards and indicates the bridge between heaven and earth, and it shows its chosenness by virtue of the fact that it's been anointed. So Jacob pours oil onto it, which you usually do with people who become kings or priests or so on, so who take on the mantle of divine mediation. And the stone is supposed to embody that. And the water that's poured at its feet is kind of like the waters of creation, the waters through which things are reborn or born in the first place. And so the birth of the Messiah is also symbolically enacted here and stands as a witness to what is still to come out of Jacob, namely the kings that are supposed to come from Jacob that God also mentions in his blessing.